I'm Jonathan Larsen with TYT Investigates, and this is TYTI Daily. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about three stories. One, the big obvious story that everyone's talking about, including the headline for this video. The other is what should be the big story of the day, but isn't, and I really wish were. And one other, a third, which is really just sort of a personal indulgence that I hope you'll indulge me with. So. The reason I keep looking down is to check and see whether our live stream is working, which will let me know that you folks can hear me and that we can have a conversation about all of this stuff once I'm done on the back end. So forgive me, I won't do it again until I am done and it's time for us to do the live section. And I see we've got a couple of regulars in there saying hello, Mr. Elder and Nathaniel Earl, so I'll take that as a sign that I can go on, and I'm going to get to the impeachment stuff in a minute. First, I want to do a really, really important story that came out from the New York Times, great reporting yesterday. So the Environmental Protection Agency is considering a new regulation, a new rule, which would be called Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science. This is from the New York Times article. And on the surface, this is what's so great about it, on the surface, strengthening transparency sounds like a good thing overall, let alone in regulatory science. And it requires that scientists disclose all of their raw data, which again, that sounds great. Why wouldn't you want to have scientists disclosing their raw data? And I'll explain why in just a moment. But first, let's be clear that this is the EPA, so the potential regulations that are affected here involve our water, our land, potentially our food, if it's getting into the water supply for our livestock, our air, climate change, emissions, all of this stuff, all of the regulations that we have in place, all the regulations that until last year have been increasing the quality of our air, all of those regulations, all of those rules are based on science, based on scientific studies that pointed the way towards what regulations would be needed to make these changes. Here's where it gets Trumpian. Disclosing the raw data for all of these studies includes disclosing the confidential medical records that were involved in assessing environmental impacts. So in other words, if there was a study done that covered 1.2 million people or something like that, to pick a number out of the article, the study requires individuals to say, here's what my health status was on this date, and here's what it was on this date. And then you take that with other raw data, particulates per million of any particular pollutant or whatever it might be, and now you can correlate environmental change with health effects. These studies were done, these people gave their medical information because the scientists doing this signed confidentiality clauses. They agreed not to release the personal individual data that was aggregated to form a scientific foundation for the study's conclusions. So basically, the effect of this rule, this new rule, would be to exclude, to undo any regulation that is based on studies, scientific studies, that are no longer admissible by this new EPA standard. So in other words, all those landmark health studies on the environment from the 70s and whatever, all of that would be out the window into the smog. So I want to read one other, right, so I guess I already covered this. This is being implemented, of course, by EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, a former coal industry lobbyist. Not a miner, of course. He's a lobbyist. What was I thinking? And he basically earlier withdrew an earlier version of this rule in a way that looked like he was thinking, well, this is not good. And then he dramatically expanded it when he resubmitted it to include past studies. So I want to read a couple of the highlights from the article. Paul Billings, Senior Vice President for Advocacy at the American Lung Association, those known radicals, says, quote, "This means the EPA can justify rolling back rules or failing to update rules based on the best information to protect public health and the environment, which means more dirty air and more premature deaths." One of the studies in particular that would be canceled out of consideration, meaning none of the rules based on it would even be allowed. A 1993 Harvard University study definitively linking polluted air to premature deaths. Involved occupational and medical histories of more than 22,000 people in 6 cities. And so what's going on here is beyond the horrific effects on babies yet to be born, right? We're talking about premature deaths, which basically means you shouldn't have died, which can include people of any age, not just old people, right? Asthmatic children, right? These are real infants born with respiratory issues. So what we're talking about here is the weaponizing of individual experience, the toxicifying of individual experience, meaning it used to be that if you were a whistleblower, for instance, just to choose an example, your claims were assessed based on their factuality. And then if they were not factual, then maybe people would go and look at your background and say, "Oh, well, you're a bad person. You're a registered Democrat, therefore you're a liar." Now what we're seeing is this is moving into science as well, right? Because let's imagine for a moment that a new study is done that complies with this new standard, and everyone in it is willing to share their medical and personal histories. How long do you think it will be before the fossil fuel industry goes after individuals, right? Registered Democrat, environmentalist, cares about their kids, right? And then they can challenge these studies on a granular basis, because now what's happening is everything is getting weaponized. And by the way, that's not just on the right. To some extent, the left started that as well, looking at people's motives and assuming people's motives based on their background. That's not unique to left or right. So if we want that to stop, the left has some work to do there as well, I think. And of course, the New York Times appropriately points out that the fossil fuel industry is one of the special interests that has long been banging the drum against exactly these kinds of scientific studies where the information is confidential. Here's the hilarious George Orwell would sit up in his grave and give a chef's kiss to this one. Discussing the strengthening transparency in regulatory science proposal, an EPA spokeswoman said, quote, "The agency does not discuss draft, deliberative documents or actions still under internal and interagency review. Transparency for thee, but not for me." What else? Do I have anything else on this one? Let's see. Yes, a couple of important things here. One other aspect of this rule, quick little footnote, just a minor thing about the entire politicization of science. According to this rule, data and statistical models used in studies that were being considered by the EPA in the future, that data, that raw data and the models would have to be made available to the agency so that the agency can go back and look at the research itself, question the research. Who decides whether that new data, those new models and the studies based on them are admissible, are usable for regulatory consideration? Quoting the Times, "The politically appointed agency administrator would have wide-ranging discretion over which studies to accept or reject." I'm going to end this chunk on 2 pieces of good news. One is that these things take time to implement, which means, in theory, this regulation, if it does go into effect, and I should note that, Wheeler said he was a little shocked at the amount of opposition registered to the previous rule. I believe it was something like the vast majority of almost 600,000 comments were against it. So there's still a regulatory process to be rolled out. There's no question that they're going to go ahead and do this regardless of what happens during that process. But in theory, that could mean that if President Trump loses re-election, we're only talking about 6 months or so in which we have this scientific hiatus, a year without a science clause, if you will, before things are put to right. Now, the other piece, the second piece of good news potentially, is that there is still at least the appearance of a public comment period. I just checked the EPA's website and I wasn't able to find a sign of it, so it may not be up yet, but once the proposal is sort of formally out there, the public will have 30 days to offer comments on the changes. And so regardless of whether you believe you're going to be listened to individually or in bulk, as it were, do it, right? That's if when we're asked, and we will be asked, we're already being asked, what did we do? At a minimum, we could say, I was standing up against destructive, damaging rollbacks of the environmental victories that we did manage to win over the past few decades. Here's the quickie self-indulgence story I wanted to talk about. Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, is reportedly considering jumping into the Democratic presidential primary. And I'm not a big Deval Patrick scholar or anything like that, so I can't give you a deep dive into his background. And this is not meant to be a commentary on Governor Patrick by any means, but I do want to talk about some of the dynamics of how this stuff gets reported. So I've got a Politico story talking about this. It was actually first reported by the Times. The Politico story talked about how the concern of donors with the current field was behind Deval Patrick considering this, and possibly as soon as this week. And we see that word tossed around a lot, donors, right? And it's a very handy, short little word that fits nicely in headlines. I want to read you a little bit from the Deval Patrick story, just so that we have a primer going forward for what that catch-all potentially means when we see it in stories about the campaign and our politics in general. Patrick's interest in the race advanced in recent weeks as top Democratic donors became increasingly concerned with the field, according to one friend who spoke to the former governor last week. The donors, if you were waiting for it, here it is. The donors, many with ties to Wall Street, see Patrick as the perfect candidate, a dynamic African-American progressive governor who got elected in a heavily white state and who also has good ties to the business community thanks to his time in Bain Capital, the firm founded by another former Massachusetts governor and former presidential candidate Mitt Romney. Quote, this is the source, a friend who spoke to former Governor Patrick. Quote, this is coming from Wall Street. They're terrified of Warren, and these guys would help Biden, but they've been in a room with him, Biden, up close, and they have doubts. So my point here is that the headline says donors, but the story doesn't say donors. It says Wall Street, and we need to be clear about that distinction. And one other point I wanted to make about this story was the sort of beauty of the self-correcting mechanism. I found myself surprised that it said that the source close to Deval Patrick, says they're terrified of Warren as opposed to Bernie Sanders. I'm not sure why that would be. Maybe that's a calculation about Warren having more electability than Sanders. I don't know. It's hard to imagine they think Warren would be more of a threat to her in terms of the policies she hopes for. Maybe they think that she's more of a threat in the policies she can actually implement, maybe anticipating that Sanders would not be as successful implementing his policies, getting them through Congress. I don't know what the thinking there was. However, here's kind of the beauty of the way the primary system and our democratic system overall works as a self-correcting mechanism. Quote, if Biden remains competitive, unquote, I'm backing up. It's very late for Deval Patrick to register now and let alone to stand up functioning operations in the earliest primary and caucus states, right? Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada. So his plan might be to fight for a stronghold a little bit further down the line. So, quote, if Biden remains competitive in the 3 prior early states and Patrick campaigns hardest in South Carolina, along with Kamala Harris, it sets up a scenario where the black vote could be divided, allowing the 2 progressives, Warren or Sanders, a better shot at winning. The exact scenario that Patrick's backers want to avoid. So it's kind of interesting to me that for all the money that Wall Street has, and for all their willingness to inject themselves, if not literally in the form of Michael Bloomberg or others, into the primary process, the way the machine is built, it makes it hard for them to push one lever without another lever tipping the way they don't want it to tip. And so we'll see whether Patrick even gets in, whether he's floating a trial balloon to see whether it makes sense to get in, whether there's a big groundswell of support for him to come in a perceived absence. But I gotta say, there's not a lot of polling out there, I think, to suggest that the Democratic electorate overall, as opposed to its donors, is unsatisfied with the current field. So those are my self-indulgent stories. One of them should be a major, huge frickin' story that everyone's talking about and is totally upset about. But I promised in the headline a quick impeachment preview. So on Wednesday, the House of Representatives, which is of course run by Democrats, they've got 3 committees doing joint hearings on the impeachment of President Donald Trump. Tomorrow, Wednesday, will be the first time those hearings are held in public, which is something Republicans have asked for. And President Trump himself has said he doesn't think they should be taking place at all, but if they are, they should be held in public. So let's keep that in mind as we begin tomorrow. And tomorrow, what we're going to see is Bill Taylor and George Kent testifying. And then on Friday, we're going to see Marie, I believe, Yovanovitch, the ambassador, the former ambassador to Ukraine, who was removed by Trump. But before we get there, I want to walk through new testimony that we have. They released the entire testimony, but also some handy excerpts of testimony given in late October by Laura Cooper, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. This is a Pentagon military official, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia. So this is her wheelhouse. She was there. She can tell you where to get a good coffee in Kiev, and she works for the Pentagon. In other words, checks all the boxes that all the NetSec groupies would tell you matter. And in one respect, Cooper's testimony is not hugely damaging in the sense that it primarily serves to confirm from another angle, right? There's been an incident at an intersection, and we're getting testimony from witnesses who saw it from different angles, right? That's how you determine whether or not all of these witness accounts are in sync, by getting as many of them as you can. So for the most part, Cooper's testimony basically does that, essentially confirms what we've heard already from Taylor, from Volker, from Sondland, from others. But there is new territory plumbed here, and it's that new territory that I really wanted to emphasize here as we go into Wednesday's hearings. So far, a lot of discussion has taken place around the idea of a quid pro quo. You give me something, say that you'll investigate the Bidens, say it publicly, and I'll give you money to, save your country from Russia. Quid pro quo. Lately, there's been some reporting about Democrats switching from quid pro quo to extortion. You're using this money that Ukraine needs for self-defense in order to get what you want out of them, a public statement about investigating Joe Biden. That's extortion. What Cooper does is give Democrats, and we'll see if they adopt it or not, an entirely new framing. It's not, you don't have to see it as a quid pro quo. You don't even have to see it as extortion. It's really important to remember that there are 2 separate things going on here. They were linked causally, right? Give me this, you get that. But that doesn't change the fact that these are 2 distinct acts, right? So we've heard a lot about the act of pressuring, and I've talked a lot about the act of pressuring, asking Ukraine for these investigations. What was that worth to the White House, right? It was basically, give me a seed that I can use in public. That's why it was important that it be a public statement, public statement. Give me that seed, because once it's public, then I can refer to it as, oh, well, everyone knows about this Ukraine investigation into Hunter Biden and Joe Biden based on him belonging to the bank of an energy company. And then you shorthand that in increments over time until it's just the Biden investigation, right? And now it occupies, it basically sits in the chair that you had reserved for the Hillary Clinton's emails slot. So that's the extortion angle, was what Trump wanted. What Cooper gives us in this new testimony is the illegality involved in not giving them the money, right? And let's remember that regardless of the money, just asking Ukraine to conduct an investigation, not to conduct it, to say publicly that there will be an investigation, just the asking of that to interfere with U.S. domestic politics, that's not okay. You can argue about whether it violates the law or not, but it certainly qualifies as a potentially impeachable offense. You can reasonably cast a vote for impeachment forget the money, based just on, I want you to investigate my political rival and say so publicly. What we've lost sight of a little bit is that the withholding of the money, even if you weren't asking for anything in return, the withholding of the money is also potentially impeachable. Why? Because it's not his money. We heard that Ambassador Sondland talked about Trump being a businessman and he's only going to give something if he's going to get something. It's not his to give. The money was appropriated by the United States Congress, which the Constitution gives the power of the purse. It's Congress's to allocate the money. It's the executive branch's role to execute that allocation. You know what I mean. The point is that the law said that Trump had to give this money up to Ukraine. Why? Because Congress had already allocated it. So let's see some excerpts from what Cooper specifically has to say. She talks about why the money mattered to Ukraine. And by the way, let's just say right now that it was really important because Ukraine was fending off the great foe Russia. I don't care if Congress had decided that Ukraine needed 400 million board games of Tiddlywinks and voted that money. If that's what they voted for, then that's what you have to give them, period. We don't get to say, oh, well, it had a very important national security component. But in this case, by the way, it also did. Here's what she says. She's asked why it was important, why the money was important to Ukraine. She says, this is in closed-door testimony from last month that's now been released. If you go back to 2014, when Ukraine found itself under attack by Russia, the state of the Ukrainian armed forces was significantly less capable than it is today. And that capability increase since 2014 is largely the result of US and allied assistance. And now what you see is a Ukrainian armed force that is able to better deter Russian aggression. And you've seen a drop in the kinetic action. Drop in the kinetic action is how you describe people not dying. Although not a complete lack of hostilities, certainly. And the one quick point I wanted to make about this was, can you imagine if a foe of the United States had intercepted a shipment of money or a shipment of arms or a shipment of aid to a US ally that was engaged in armed combat and suffered casualties at the time? They would be screaming terrorism. They would be sorry, that's what they would be doing. They would be barking terrorism nonstop. Okay. Ruby. Sorry. Okay. Referring to May 2019, the Department of Defense, in coordination with other agencies, certified that Ukraine had met the anti-corruption benchmark set by the Pentagon. In other words, once the money is allocated, it has to go through certain hurdles, right? They have to be certified that the recipient is in fact sufficiently not corrupt, right? That happened in May, well before all of this anti-corruption stuff is still taking place. So Trump is still talking about Ukraine's corruption after the Pentagon and other agencies have already determined that Ukraine has met the benchmark set by it. Here we go. Here's what she says, and she's specific. This past year, we were looking at a few things. This is what was involved in certifying Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts. We were looking at progress on command and control reform. We were looking at a commitment to pursue defense industry reform. We were in other words, will this military aid get, sent off to someone's cronies in a truck, or will it actually be used for military aid? We were looking to the Ukrainian government to pass a law that would enable government-to-government procurement. This would enable them to use our system. And these are examples of some of the benchmarks. The year before, it had just been one broad category. So it was an even more tightly codified system or standards that Ukraine had to meet. Question, and who determines whether these benchmarks have been met? Answer, in this case, in May of this year, it was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Rood, who provided the certification to Congress after coordination with the State Department. And here's where we get to the whole, say, isn't that illegal part? So in July, they get the apportionment for tranche of the military money. The 26th, quoting her again now, the 26th was the meeting that I was the backbenchers with the deputies level. And there it was, to me anyway, in my experience, it was the first time it was stated very clearly that yes, both of the tranches of military money are affected by this hold, and that it relates to the president's concerns about corruption. And that is what, in that meeting, Mike Duffy from OMB said. OMB, Office of Management and Budget, they're the ones who write the checks. Question, and the president is authorized to have these types of holds placed, correct? Answer, well, I'm not an expert on the law, but in that meeting, immediately, deputies began to raise concerns about how this could be done in a legal fashion, because there was broad understanding in the meeting that the funding was specific to Ukraine's security assistance and was related to an earmark for it. So the comments in the room at the deputies level reflected a sense that there was not an understanding of how this could legally play out. In other words, all of these experts are sitting around saying, that's not legal. That's what she's saying here. And at that meeting, the deputies agreed to look into the legalities and to look at what was possible. In other words, it was clear to all these people who do this for a living that what the White House was saying was, I want to do something not legal. And so they all looked at that and thought, where do we go from here? Let's go find out whether there's a loophole or a clause or whatever, but let's go find something. July 31st, an interagency meeting. Quoting Cooper again. My understanding was that there were two legally available mechanisms should the president want to stop assistance. And one mechanism would be presidential rescission notice to the Congress, and the other mechanism, as I understood it and articulated it in that meeting, was for the Defense Department to do a reprogramming action. But I mentioned that either way, there would need to be a notification to Congress. In other words, they come back and there are only two mechanisms they can find for legally stopping, at this point, the money from going to Ukraine, which wants to use it to reduce kinetic action / people dying. And both of those methods require, by law, a notification notifying Congress. Question, and did that occur? Answer, that did not occur. Question, in the first meeting where you described, a question was raised about what are the legally available mechanisms to actually suspend this aid or hold this aid. Did someone raise that issue in using different terminology, as in, is this lawful? Can this be done lawfully? Is this a violation of law? In other words, did someone drop the euphemisms and say, hey, is this a crime? Answer, so that was in the deputies meeting that first conversation that I recall arose, and I don't remember that exact phraseology being used, but I mean, there were many affirmative statements that the Congress has appropriated this, we need to obligate it, meaning actually send it to them. Question, under the law? Answer, again, I don't remember that exact phrase, but yes. So they all knew. And they were all trying to figure out what to do about the fact that they all knew. So the bottom line point here is that it wasn't that asking for thing X in return for thing Y was illegal. This was illegal and this was illegal. Both things were impeachable offenses. And whether one was in return for the other, that maybe gets you to 3 impeachable offenses, but I'm not sure that a quid pro quo is a meaningful standard of legality here. You're not allowed to ask for foreign assistance in domestic politics, and you're not allowed to hold up money that Congress has appropriated. Just because you're doing this because you want this doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. But these two still individually alone are both out of bounds as well. And what we're going to see in the impeachment hearings is establishing that both of those things happened. And as we get further and further into the hearings, we're going to see them build the case. This thing happened, and then we're going to, as we get deeper into it, we're going to see who ordered it, who said this must happen, who said this must happen, and why. Okay, so thanks for hanging around for 3 stories, which makes this almost like a newscast, I guess, but except for I have a barking dog in the middle. And I'm totally expecting to go back into the live chat now and see that Ruby going nuts because the doorbell rang is the one thing that you guys are most excited about. And I don't blame you. How fun is that? Shalako says top of the morning to you, top of the morning, although it's just afternoon here on the East Coast. Bonnie says good morning. DLJ says good to start on time again. Thank you. I cannot emphasize enough my gratitude to Ken Klippenstein, our senior investigative reporter, for his great story yesterday. I hope you guys have all checked it out. It was co-published with The Intercept. We worked on it with them, and it was published on both websites, so it's a joint production. And if you haven't seen Ken talking about it in yesterday's edition of TYTI Daily, I hope you'll go rectify that immediately. And just as gratified as I am to Ken, I also am gratified to you folks for letting him know that he should be starting on time at 11:30 Eastern. So don't be afraid to let him know. Mr. Elder says, I missed yesterday. I had things to do. Well, good news. It was on tape. You can still watch. Mr. Elder says, I like Ken too. Me, as do I. Mr. Elder says, the only thing I don't like when Ken does the show is he won't go for an hour like Jonathan. Well, I mean, Ken probably has more pride and more, what's the integrity, right? To some extent, I feel like, why am I still talking? Who cares? But I don't honor that anymore because you folks have been nice enough to encourage me to keep going. So Ken probably still honors that valid inner conscience that says, you're just, going for the clickbait or whatever. Curious Cleo says, agreed. I like the chat portion. Me too. Again, I've said this before, but I always see it as a selfish indulgence to get to interact directly with you folks. I work at home. Who else do I talk to? Nails and Glitter says, me too. I enjoy these morning chats, even though I don't type very often. That's quite all right. Mr. Elder says, me too, because Jonathan will get into other things. This is true. Dragging or screaming, I probably will. Patrick's Time says Barr is no Mueller. I'm not sure what that means, but we've already seen some indication that even Barr has lines that he won't cross. Trump is denying this story that Barr said he would not issue a public statement exonerating him regarding the Ukraine stuff. Really Cool says the effect of this decision won't change even if Trump gets removed tomorrow. Gotta wait till President Sanders is inaugurated in 2021. This is referring to the new EPA rule. The proposal, it's not in effect yet. It's going to undergo a 30-day comment period, basically saying no science allowed in our regulatory firmament. Mr. Elder talks about his aches and pains. Sorry to hear that, Mr. Elder. Patrick's Time says if it's strong and comes out soon, the IG report will do some real damage to the Democrats' impeachment charade. It would show that resistance bureaucrats really are conspiring to take down Trump. So here's what I would say about that. There are always supposed to be people in the government conspiring, aka talking, about opposing the president. And that's what checks and balances means, okay? That's why you have an IG, right? The very existence of an inspector general is checks and balances writ small, right? It's fractal. We've got 3 branches, and then within those branches, we also have checks and balances, checks and balances. And what Trump and his supporters, or at least his rabid supporters, I think some of his marginal supporters get this. What Trump doesn't seem to get, and his most fervent base doesn't seem to get, is you are supposed to be fighting. People are supposed to, they are obliged to, they are sworn to surface information that may, it doesn't even have to be proof, just may, possible evidence that the president did something wrong. They are sworn and obliged by their oath, by their integrity, by the American dream to come forward with it. That's the project of America. Alice Murphy says, oh, you guys are talking about cures for Mr. Elder's ailments. Really Cool says, billionaire tears are beautiful. I missed that clip where that one billionaire tears up. Nails and Glitter says, I think they're more afraid of Warren because she's more reasonable to moderates. And I think I was trying to get at that. I think you're right. And that dynamic could apply both in terms of her getting elected, but also in terms of potentially her being more effective in passing things and implementing things than Sanders. So Sanders might be more ambitious in terms of what he would want to do, but maybe they're calculating that Warren might actually be more effective in terms of implementing it. Curious Cleo says Sanders is a threat. They're just ignoring him in the mainstream media. He has just as many plans for the wealthy as Warren. Yeah, I think that certainly seems to be the case. Patrick's Time says a review of Warren's campaign donations to her presidential and Senate campaigns reveal that she's received donations from more than 30 billionaires during her time in politics. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but okay, that could be true. Nails and Glitter says, get rid of the billionaires doesn't line up with land of the free, but make them pay their fair share is much more palatable. I'm thinking. I'm not sure it doesn't line up with land of the free. I think that whole notion of individual autonomy and the worship of individual autonomy and the dedication to valuing individual autonomy over collective well-being is a real toxic part of where we are now. And I don't think you can make an argument that individual autonomy is a somehow superior manifestation of freedom than is collective well-being. Obviously, you want individuals to have autonomy to do and to act as they will in a way that does not infringe on the rights of others. But being a billionaire, preventing the existence of billionaires doesn't prevent you from doing anything. It just makes it impossible for you to get things as a result. That's not limiting your freedom. You can still go out and start a business, but a ban on billionaires, let's say a wealth tax that hit 100% at 990 million or something, a wealth tax doesn't stop you from doing anything. It just stops you from getting too much as a result. Really Cool says, Wall Street fears Warren because they are ridiculously blind to Bernie. That certainly, I think, is a possible theory, that they don't take him seriously. Maybe it's as simple as that. Patrick's Time says, Warren is Clinton 2.0. Don't know what that means. And I certainly think that Warren and Clinton would differ significantly on a number of issues there, Patrick. B. Blondie says, Warren more directly, I think, calls out Wall Street, while Bernie has a more broad view. I think that's roughly fair, right? I think I'm not a scholar of either of their plans, but the way I see them talked about is that Warren is talking about making sure that Wall Street plays fair within the system, and Bernie is more invested in changing the system fundamentally. B. Blondie continues, Sanders includes Wall Street, but not completely. They should be afraid of both, and that's why they want Bloomberg to run. That could very well be. Reptile Z says, hi peeps, endorse. Curious Cleo says, Warren is better than Clinton. Really cool says, abolish ICE plus abolish billionaires plus the entire donor class structure. Milo Wadlin says, Bloomberg, Patrick, Wall Street must have found Biden really dubious. I mean, there's two possibilities here. One is that I talked earlier about the source in that Politico story, I think it was, saying that some of the Wall Street connected donors have been in the room with Biden for some of his high dollar fundraisers, and they're not too excited by what they're seeing. They're a little concerned. I don't have the quote right in front of me, but the problem is that the quote is sufficiently ambiguous. I'll read it right here. Now I do have it in front of me. Quote, they've been in a room with him up close and they have doubts. So the doubts could be one or both of two kinds. One could be that they individually think, oh, I'm not crazy about this guy. The other doubt could be, I doubt whether America is going to want this. So, and those are two different dynamics, right? So I don't think we can automatically conclude that billionaires who have seen Biden up close sort of subscribe to this narrative that's out there about Biden, having trouble maintaining a coherent line of thought. I have to speak extemporaneously every day, and I have trouble keeping a coherent line of thought. Hopefully my own digressions are a reflection of a vibrant, active, curious mind rather than one that's falling apart. But we just don't know. It's remains to be seen. But the bigger point is that I was trying to make about that story is when we talk about donors, it's important to know which donors we're talking about, and you can't elide that factor in a headline responsibly, I think. If it's Wall Street, say Wall Street. It's only a few more letters than donors. And if it's not Wall Street, say grassroots or something, but differentiate. It matters. The impact of donors on the Democratic primaries already, whether you looked at just the number of billionaire donors or just the number of billionaire candidates, either one of those should be sufficiently troubling to the Democratic Party and electorate as a whole to give some real thought to what it means to see the impact, the political impact of economic equality manifest right there in front of you, right? We're seeing it. We're seeing the impact of economic equality right there in the Democratic field, behind the scenes with the checkbooks and on the stage with the checkbooks. Patrick's Time says, Trump exposing corruption is not illegal. Well, it depends how he does it, right? If he exposes non-existent corruption in order to help himself politically, then yeah, it is. Just because you call the Biden stuff corruption doesn't mean it's an actual crime that merits investigation. And the fact is, he wasn't trying to expose corruption. He was trying to get Ukraine to say they were investigating corruption. He wasn't trying to expose it. This stuff was already known. And it had already been looked into by law enforcement. What he was asking for was a press release, not an investigation, not even a conviction. All the man wanted was a press release. Literally, Trump's people were helping to write it. And by helping, I mean writing it. Pause for Design says, Bernie doesn't believe in billionaires' existence ethically, but in policies seeking to tax them, finally enforce the antitrust laws, and remove their ability to buy elections. Mr. Elder says, Bernie is after massive change across the board. Warren wants small changes. Both are good. Bernie is better, and between the two, Bernie is the most progressive. Warren, I would say, is moderate progressive. Patrick's Time says, Bernie never had a real job. Actually, being a United States Senator is not only a very real job that probably involves more than 40 hours a week, but being a politician in this country used to be, and ought to be again, but oddly isn't under this current president, considered a point of pride, right? They are honored at civic luncheons all the time. They are asked to speak at commencement ceremonies, right? Politician should not be a dirty word. If it is a dirty word, maybe that's a reflection more on some of the individual politicians we have. But to say overall that being a politician is not a real job, it's embarrassing. It's un-American. It's un-American. The entire point of the American enterprise was to create politicians, right? You don't need politicians if you have a king. You just need bureaucrats who do what the king says. A politician's job is to enact, to embody the noblest impulse of the US Constitution, which is representational democracy. Really cool, points out a couple of things that I did not get to. SCOTUS hearing DACA, the Dreamers case, as well as temporary protected status for refugees, economic refugees, people like that, refugees from natural disasters who have temporary immigration status due to those extenuating circumstances. Patrick's time. Patrick's time says Bernie was robbed in 2016 by HRC and stood down like the beta he is. Okay. Patrick Seguin says it's more real than what Patrick Stein believes in his fake world. Pause for Design says longer term, I think Bernie would do more for economic justice that would negatively impact billionaires. I'll happily bathe in their tears. But they'll charge us along the way. I mean, that's the thing where we are right now, right? We're in a period where we right now, and probably our children, comprise generations that are going to have to pay a price for the mistakes of previous generations so that the lives of subsequent generations are better. We're going to have to pay a price in terms of transitioning away from economic inequality, right? Because they're going to put up a fight. The people who grabbed, the 1% who grabbed up all those resources, they're going to put up a fight. And they're going to use biochemical hazmat weapons, whatever they can use, they will use it. They will set us against each other. They will tell us lies. They will feed us toxins along the way. And this will last for a generation, or will just continue to go down the hole. And the previous generations let it happen, right? In the 70s, they started letting labor protections slip away. In the 80s, they started handing over more and more corporate immunity to corporations, stripping corporate power from shareholders, giving it to boards, all of it, aggregating power and money towards the top. And the top is not going to give it up without a fight. And that's a fight that we have to have. We can't be content anymore with just watching the incremental change grind away at the future for our children. We also have to be the generation that deals with the blowback from the, let's see if I can get all these, Christian, white, male, straight, what am I forgetting? Hegemony that has run this country forever. We are going to be the generation that has to minimize and delegitimize the blowback from that cohort against their loss of power. The demographic tide is coming. There's nothing you can do about it any more than you can any other tide. And they also, like the 1%, and sometimes in coordination with the 1%, are going to put up a fight. They don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up their money. We have to be the generations. It doesn't have to be us against each other. We can consider ourselves one generation. Everyone alive today, from the kids who are all right to the okay boomers, right? All of us can define ourselves as a generation if all of us, or at least most of all of us, decide that we are willing to spend our days, our time on earth, fighting those fights so that things are better for our children and our children's children. Patrick's Time says, Bernie no longer talks about millionaires now that he has millions. I would guess that Bernie talks about millionaires. Pause for Design says, Patrick's Time, you have a right to your opinion, but you do understand that you're framing relays the idea that you ascribe to a toxically masculine idea of power, right? I would watch this discussion. I would seriously watch this discussion. Patrick's Time says toxic masculinity doesn't exist. Reptile Z. So I referred earlier to Ruby because Ruby started barking when the doorbell rang. And I said Ruby or something like that. And Reptile Z reminds me, I thought the dog's name was Clickbait. So usually, yeah, I have called her Clickbait. Usually she's, she's gone now. Usually she's sitting on the couch behind me and people have spotted her before and are like, oh, look at the cute doggy. So I called her Clickbait. Nails and Glitter says some won't vote for Bernie, just like Biden. Some moderates will choose their guns over corruption. Patrick's Time says if Democrats had evidence of a crime, they would have held an impeachment vote. So maybe you missed it, but they held an impeachment vote. They actually did it. It's already done. It's in the books. It passed. So by your reasoning, well, actually, logically, that doesn't quite hold up. That's an if A, then B. Never mind. But the point is, they did, Patrick. Mr. Elder says Bernie earned that money, unlike most of the other ones who robbed it from the American people, and Bernie would be taxed too if Bernie had 33 million. So again, not again, but I do wonder whether Senator Sanders would say that he earned that money, right? Did he earn that money more than someone who digs ditches or you know, works a McDonald's griddle, you know, 10, 12 hours a day? I'm not sure that that's the case. And I think the whole notion of earning, what it means to have earned something, just because you got money as a result of something that was legal, doesn't mean you actually earned it. You may have received it, you may have obtained it or acquired it. To earn means deserve, right? Technically speaking, we use earn as like a shorthand for, oh, what do you earn a year? What do you earn a month or whatever? But it has a moral connotation. And I think for that reason, people are starting to wonder, wait a minute, how is it that, you know, navigating leveraged buyouts should earn you billions of dollars, but teaching kindergarten children should not? What's the moral calculation there? So it would be great if we could reconsider the entire notion of what it means to earn something. Patrick's Time says Democrats don't pick their nominee. CNN and DNC will pick your candidate, just like 2016. Mr. Elder says they wouldn't even be doing impeachment if there wasn't proof. So I don't disagree with that, but I do think it's important that we differentiate between proof and evidence, right? Proof means something is without a doubt. You've proved it. It is true. And we are supposed to suspend, you know, we're supposed to assume innocence until proven guilty. And I recognize that this is not a court of law. We don't have to ascribe the same presumption of innocence to Mr. Trump. But I think it's a good idea, just in general, for us, when there is a lawful system for determining guilt, that we belay our judgments until that system has a chance to get to work. Patrick's Time says Democrats are still looking for a crime. Honestly, I'm not sure how much you read up on this stuff, but it was when you say still looking, it's like saying I'm at a restaurant or a diner with a massive menu saying I'm still looking for something to eat. Doesn't mean there's nothing to eat. It means there's so much to eat that I can't decide. So when you say they're looking for a crime, that's been the bigger issue, is they haven't been able to settle on one thing. Emoluments, obstruction of justice, Ukraine. Rob P says AOC 2028. Man. Patrick Syme says media is lying to the masses. And look, so I'll repeat a little mantra I have about media. We should be skeptical of media, but being skeptical does not mean assuming that they are wrong. It means not not being sure that they are right. There's a difference. There's room in between. So if you're not sure that they're right, do the work. Figure out what the reality is. Don't just immediately assume that whatever they say, the opposite must be true. Nails and Glitter says, then we should fund schools, not media. Really cool doesn't want me to feed the trolls. Patrick Stein says public schools have failed our kids, and that's a relatively bipartisan sentiment. We've seen a lot of that from Democrats, and I think Democrats have started to wise up that they got played there. That the aggregate numbers may not be great, but most schools are doing pretty well, and a handful are doing really poorly and need to be saved with money, by the way, with the act of throwing money at them. And the reason you know that's true is because virtually all the people who say we can't fix education by throwing money at it send their kids to private schools. So, yeah. It's very tempting when the ostensible victim of a crisis is someone sympathetic, like kids, where we want to demonstrate concern for them. It's very tempting to buy into the notion of a crisis. The problem is that very often crises are prepackaged and sold with solutions. And the real purpose of selling us the crisis is to sell us the solution. In this case, things like privatization, charter schools, vouchers for religious schools, and things like that. Mr. Elder says Fox News is the biggest liars. I'll give my quick version of my take on Fox News. To whatever extent you believe Fox News is a toxic influence on United States politics, democracy, whatever, it is my contention, and I haven't watched Fox News lately, so I should maybe say it has been in the past, my contention, that the biggest problem with Fox has not been what they say, but what they choose to talk about. In other words, they've managed to shift our internal sense of what to focus on away from material things and towards ephemeral essentialist things like the war on Christmas, which apparently we're now fighting again. Symbolic things, things that have to do with the essence of patriotism or religion, all of these things that don't actually materially impact people's lives, but feel like attacks on the essences of things we care about. My country is under attack. Well, if by under attack you mean some people are coming here who have a lower crime rate and will bring the crime rate down and will do jobs that we're struggling to fill, I guess that's an attack. But if you don't talk about the material impacts and you just say it's an invasion, now we're talking about the Americanness being under threat rather than actual Americans being under threat. And to me, that's always been the biggest problem with Fox News, is that it gets us talking about the wrong things. I can feel my throat is actually starting to hoarsen up, so I'm probably going to say goodbye soon. Jess, Love is Louder, says, restrict speech. Oh, you mean like Trump did, Jr. did over this past weekend when they booked a Q&A segment on his book and then revoked it? Like that free speech? I gotta say, I just said we talk about the wrong things, and we totally do. And I didn't click through on any of the Donald Trump Jr. triggered stuff. But if we can recognize that that's an amusing sideshow, then okay, that's fine. The problem is when we get invested in stuff like that, and we think it matters or proves something or is evidence of something, and we start trotting it out as evidence of blah, blah, blah. We've got to be able to be the grown-ups in the room and stop caring about whether the book tour for the president's son's book and his reaction to how it's just, guys, we've got to stop. And I'm not saying you guys are bad talking about it in the chat. That's fine. That's my point, is that it's okay, like in the family, to find that stuff amusing and everything. But again, like the problem with Twitter, which I think to some extent is starting to supplant cable news as a driver of the conversation. The problem with Twitter is there's no differentiation between page A1, the front page, and page C23, right? The comics or whatever. And so the thing that is starting to drive our news, just like cable did, and just like cable, it's elevating things that don't matter. We are very bad. We've gotten very bad at epistemologically knowing what is important and what we should be devoting our energies and our attention to. Patrick's Time says free speech is the solution, and I'm glad we found something we can agree on, and it's going to make me circle back to a point I wanted to make about the EPA rules that we talked about, the strengthening transparency in regulatory science. Their concern, or their alleged position here, here's a quote from Wheeler, the EPA administrator. He says, "Good science is science that can be replicated and independently validated, science that can hold up to scrutiny. That is why we're moving forward to ensure that the science supporting agency decisions is transparent and available for evaluation by the public and stakeholders." So what he's doing is suggesting that possibly there's bad science there, and the answer to bad science is to be able to replicate it, right? Is to verify it. The answer to alleged bad science is to verify it. And you do that by opening it up and seeing whether you can take those results and replicate them and all that. But that's bad science because that stifles participation in real science, right? So the little catchphrase I came up with, which relates to what you said about the answer to free speech is more free speech. The answer to good science is not bad science, it's more science. The answer to alleged bad science is good science and more science. And so if the EPA really has doubts about these studies, do a new one. Just do another one. Is that throwing money at it? Yeah, throw money at it. That's what we do with problems. We throw money at them. That's why people have lawyers. That's why people have contractors. We do that all the time with all of our biggest problems. So why the hell wouldn't we here? If the EPA administrator really thinks that the science that no one has questioned and scores of scientific organizations have endorsed, if he really thinks that that's bad science, don't impose new rules that will make all science forward suspect. Just do another study. Do another one. It's not that hard. It stimulates the economy and it gets you more science along the way, creates jobs, do it. So I'll end on that. The answer to bad science isn't less science, it's more science. With that said, I'm not sure exactly what we're going to be doing tomorrow. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to live tweet or what we'll do here in terms of, wow, we just got a fan. William Sullivan just gave us some money. Thank you, William Sullivan. I confess, I'm still unsure of how you do that, but I love that people are motivated to do that. And please don't feel bad if you can't afford to join the ranks of the William Sullivans out there who do support us financially. I see it as an equal contribution when you dedicate your time, your investment, not just to being here, but to sharing our content, to talking about what we have to say, subscribing, liking, following on Facebook, all of that stuff, that is all supporting what we do here, not just the commentary, but also our original reporting, right? So in the mornings, I go through the news, I try to find stories that matter so I can have something useful to say about them, and then mostly in the afternoon, because of your support, because of William Sullivan's support, because of everyone's support, I am able to get on the phone and talk to sources and go through obscure records and look for archived websites that reveal information that isn't out there otherwise. That's what I do with mostly my afternoons, sometimes my evenings, sometimes my early mornings because of you guys. So thanks for taking care of us. Please take care of yourselves. Please take care of each other. And one way or the other, impeachment inquiry hearings or not, we'll see you here tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time here on TYTI Daily. Bye, guys. Take care.